I think one of the interesting things about this team is going to be the spacing. And I think a lot of people who are KU fans almost kind of roll their eyes because they're like, you have KJ Adams next to Hunter Dickinson yet again. The issue isn't necessarily with KJ Adams in that equation because Hunter Dickinson can stretch the floor. He's shown that before. Where the spacing gets messed up is when Hunter Dickinson goes through a big slump and people don't have to guard him out there anymore. When he's able to make those shots and when he's able to play sort of that pick and pop role, the spacing with KJ matters a lot less.
Thanks for listening to KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank. If you're thinking about starting a business or know someone who is, check out Emprise Bank's SBA loans. It's always good to know your options, and they can be your partner in possible. Pay heed, all who enter. Beware, this podcast. That's right, this is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer. I'm here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. And we are going to spend the next 40 minutes breaking down every angle of KU football's bye week. That's right. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the bye week? How is the bye week going to affect the team? No, I'm just kidding. I don't have the energy for the bye week. We'll circle back at some point. It is a bye week for Kansas, though, on the football side. And so we decided this would be a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit of KU basketball with Nail Light Night in the Fall coming up in just over a week from now. It'll be a week from Friday, a week from this coming Friday, depending on when you're listening to the show. So basketball season's around the corner. And with the way KU football's been playing, I think we're kind of things have come full circle a little bit with the wait till basketball season talk type stuff, which is unfortunate. But nonetheless, so if you like the show, if you like what you were watching or hearing, you can subscribe on YouTube at Kansas Jocks KCSN on YouTube. You can also leave us a 5-star rating and review. You can also hit us up on the KCSN Mint Mobile hotline at 913-407-6524 to share your thoughts on the state of KU football, KU basketball. KU volleyball is a top 10 team right now, if you have any takes on that. And plenty more. 913-407-6524 is the number if you want to hit us up on the KCSN Mint Mobile hotline. Or you can always just drop a comment on YouTube. We've got some great fans that comment on our YouTube shows as well. So thank you to everyone that interacts with our content, watches, listens, comments, all of the above. Okay, as I said, we're going to kind of set the table here for KU basketball as the season is pretty close, right? You've got an exhibition with Arkansas coming up in about 2 weeks as well at Arkansas before the season kicks off officially on November 4th for KU basketball. And per usual, Kansas has a very difficult non-conference schedule, including North Carolina coming down on Fieldhouse. Of course, you got the Champions Classic as well. You also have that Las Vegas game they're going to play against Duke as well at the what is being billed as the Vegas Showdown, Kevin. Vegas Showdown. Very original name. You wonder where it's played? Oh, it's played in Vegas. Vegas Showdown. You also got the Big 12 Big East battle against Creighton at Creighton. You got just Missouri in there as well for Kansas before they start conference play. So we'll kind of set the table for all that. Look at this team throughout the rest of the show here. But this is another year where, of course, Kansas has high expectations. They have put together another pretty talented roster overall via the transfer portal, added in a lot of players. You know, Bill Self has, certainly over the last really year and a half, 2 years, I would say, gone all in on the NIL, on the trying to get the best players. And the result has been you got a guy, Hunter Dickinson, on the team last year, who numbers-wise, I think probably did live up to expectations, generally speaking. But obviously, I think kind of with the way the season ended last year and the season went for KU, you know, you had the Kevin Kohler injury that kind of overshadowed things, and Kansas kind of spiraled from there. They end up losing big in the NCAA tournament against Gonzaga. But it's KU basketball, so once again, you're expecting another top 5 team in the preseason coming into this year in 2024. And some new interesting pieces, some pieces that are obviously local to Lawrence with a guy like Zeke Moyo, and some new pieces coming in from outside that they're going to try to mesh together. When you look at this team overall, Kevin, we'll just kind of start with some general thoughts here on KU at this point. How are you feeling about KU looking like probably another top 5 team, I would think, whenever the AP poll comes out? And obviously, it's going to be a loaded Big 12. How do you kind of assess them in the preseason before the start of the year?
Yeah, they're a Big 12 title contender, which makes them a national title contender, right? When you look at like Bart Torvik, for instance, which has already put out his numbers for the upcoming season, I think Kansas is 4th nationally, which makes them 3rd in the Big 12. because you have Houston at 1 and Iowa State at 3. And I wouldn't focus on being third. I think all of those teams are kind of grouped together, and a lot will depend on it. But, Nick, you look at a lot of the weaknesses that they had a year ago, and one of the things that Bill Self is so good at, and a reason he's a Hall of Fame coach, is he adapts incredibly well. He's able to change really well, a lot better than most coaches. And we've seen in the past when he's had a down year, they've really, really bounced back. You look at the 19 team that, cost them the streak, within the Big 12, had the injury. It looked awesome to start the year, had the injury to Doak. Things kind of went south. They rebound with the 2020 team that, was one of Self's best teams and probably was in line to win the national title before COVID. You look at the very next year when COVID really impacted the season, Kansas didn't get the boost from Allen Fieldhouse because there's nobody in Allen Fieldhouse for the.
Well, hey, they had what was it? They allowed 1,500 people in there.
Yeah, it was not not the best, but yes, they wind up having another down year. Self says in the post game press conference after getting run by USC, we've got to get more athletic. We got to do this and that. And then they run it back with mostly the same guys, but, a few changes here and there, and they actually win the national title. Now you have another team last year that I think a lot of people had really high expectations for that fell apart for a lot of different reasons. If we want to be, the Arterio Morris thing was a huge blow when all of that happened and went down, and I'm sure a lot of people would say, hey, that was predictable. You should have known better, but when you look at where Kansas was and the way Kansas looked in its preseason games that they played that summer, the loss of Arterio Morris was a pretty significant one, especially when you pair that with some of the injuries. Kevin McCullough was playing like a first-team All-American, and then he gets hurt. Nick Timberlake is a guy that came in with a terrific shooting resume, and for a lot of the season didn't shoot the ball very well. Elmarco Jackson came in as a McDonald's All-American and kind of lost his confidence and lost his role in that starting lineup along the way. And so any two of those could be destructive, but you had a whole bunch of those. You add in, Hunter Dickinson, who was shooting the absolute cover off the ball to start the year, went through just a brutal slump from deep, and all of a sudden Kansas couldn't stretch the court with the guys that they had. And all of those things factored into a disappointing season. And the reason I bring all of that up and probably talk too long in doing so is because I think Self adapted and really pushed back against what troubled them a year ago. When you look at some of the guys that he brought in, AJ Storr is a guy that can go and get his own shot and can really score. Mayo's a guy that's a tremendous shooter, and not just a really good shooter, Nick, but a really good shooter off the dribble. It's kind of like that Devontae Graham thing where he didn't necessarily need to be open in order to get his shot off and take outside shots in the fast break and all the things that come along with that. You had, Coit, another guy that really filled it up from deep. Shaq Moore, I think, is a guy that helps DeJuan Harris to where he doesn't have to play 38 minutes a game when Shaq Moore is healthy. He's going to miss the first, couple months or so of the season. He's somebody that can give Harris cover, and I think there's some offense there that can be tapped into as well. I don't think Hunter Dickinson, knocking on wood, is going to go through the same sort of slump from the outside that he had in that portion a year ago. You had Rylan Griffin, another guy that can shoot the ball. And the weaknesses I feel like last year that kind of added up were a lack of shooting, a lack of scoring, and a lack of depth. And I think that Bill Self really set out to fix those issues over this offseason through the portal.
Yeah, the depth, I think, is certainly the big one that I'm focused on. I mean, Bill Self has gone out and I think he even said publicly he wants to have 8 starters. And what he means by that is having 8 starter caliber players. And he's really kind of positioned himself to have that this season. You mentioned the injuries as well from last year. Kansas has already been kind of bit by the injury bug this year. You lose Marco Jackson to an injury that's probably going to be season ending, way back in the summer. Shaq Moore, we'll see about his status as we get closer to the season. Those are 2 guys you were expecting to have. really that kind of forced, I think, KU to go out and get a guy like David Coit to add to that backcourt because of some of the early injuries they had there. But yeah, the lack of depth was significant for Kansas. Bill Self had said many times over the course of the season last year, hey, we've got maybe the best starting five in the country. And at certain times, that certainly appeared to be the case.
Yeah.
The problem is that you that best starting five, it was great, but you didn't have anybody else that could supplement that. And then you started to deal with injuries within that starting five, and it became like a house of cards, and the whole thing just kind of started to collapse down the stretch for Kansas. So adding that extra depth was huge. You mentioned some of the names, the guys to highlight: AJ Storr, Rylan Griffin, Zeke Mayo. Zeke Mayo, obviously, I think is the most notable one because he's a Lawrence guy, best friends with Devin Neal. Yep. Devin Neal kind of helped recruit him to come back to KU, come back to Lawrence. And he was a guy that early on, it seemed like maybe he was having a bit of an adjustment period to this level of basketball, but all signs point to him being a really, really quality player now over the course of the summer, getting adapted to this Kansas team. And I think he's going to be a very significant contributor for KU, both as a secondary ball handler for DeJuan Harris. You know, you mentioned a guy like Shaq Moore was going to help out there as well. But I think also Zeke Mayo fills that role. And then on top of that, just a pure scoring guard, right?
Yeah.
Which KU has not had for a while, for a little bit at that level. So I think that's where Zeke Mayo is going to hopefully slot in and be somebody that can be very effective and really create his own shot and open up opportunities for other guys and shoot the three ball well. I mean, he's a high 30s three-point shooter. I think there may be some KU fans that surface level will look at that and say, oh my gosh, he's from South Dakota State. He's from a mid-major. We just saw what happened with Nick Timberlake from a mid-major and how horribly he turned out. I would say Nick Timberlake is, generally speaking, an aberration. Like, more often than not, shooting will translate to a certain extent.
Sure.
To a higher level, right? You're probably not gonna see that level of drop off from a guy moving up levels really very often. So I would say, do not compare Zeke Mayo to Nick Timberlake. I think there's a lot more that Zeke Mayo has to offer to KU offensively, just from a ball handling standpoint as well. On top of that, and then really the guy that everyone talked about last year, but that has kind of got under the radar, I think, when kind of piecing together the team this year is KJ Adams, right?
Sure.
KJ Adams he's still there. He's not going anywhere. Obviously, we know about how much Bill Self really loves his style of play, and he's the type of player that I think all teams need, but maybe not necessarily as like a focal starring role type, which maybe was part of the issue last year for KU with some of the injuries they dealt with. But KJ Adams, he's going to slot in somewhere. Obviously, Hunter Dickinson. You think about some of the freshmen that KU brought in, Flory Badunga. I don't really know how significant of a role he'll play this year. Marquise Passmore is another interesting one who I think he has the potential as the year goes on to have a significant role, but early on, not really sure. You look at the wings that KU has on this team. You mentioned AJ Storr. Rylan Griffin's another one as well. Griffin, I think certainly from a defensive perspective, is going to be significant for Kansas. But Storr is, to me, maybe the most interesting piece that this team has, in the sense that he's another guy that can be a scorer, can be a pure scorer. On the defensive side, not so much. So the question kind of becomes, can Bill Self mold AJ Storr into more of an all-around player? Because, listen, we've seen it in the past. Bill Self is not afraid to, bench a guy or not play a guy if he's not willing to be as dedicated at one end of the floor as he is at the other. So I'm very curious with AJ Storr how he's going to fit in and what kind of contributor he can be to this team, because I think at the end of the day, he may turn into sort of an X-factor type guy for this team over the course of the season where, you have Hunter Dickinson, you have DeJuan Harris kind of running things. Zeke Mayo can be a great contributor. Rylan Griffin's a solid defender, but who's the X-factor? I think it may be AJ Storr, and the question is, can he basically grab that role by the horn, so to speak, and fulfill that for this team?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I think AJ Storr has the ability to be the rounded guy that you're talking about in terms of defending it and rebounding it. It's not an ability issue.
Yeah, I mean, he's 7'2",
He's been kind of an indifferent defender, and he's been kind of an indifferent rebounder. And we've seen that a lot of times those guys haven't played super well with Bill Self, because Bill Self has wanted them to contribute in those areas. Do you realize, within Bill Self's system, I'm asking this rhetorically, obviously you realize, like, how good you have to be as a scorer in order for Bill Self to basically be like, no, it's okay that you're not doing the other stuff. And Storer has the ability to be a really good scorer, too. Like you said, he can be an X-Factor guy. He could be a matchup guy that a lot of people struggle to defend because they just don't have guys like him on the court. But he needs to take care of that other stuff if he's going to get all those opportunities. And that's why I think Griffin has that level of intrigue, too, right? Because I don't think Griffin has the upside or the pop that an AJ Storer does. But if Griffin comes in, he shoots fairly well and he defends, he's going to have a pretty good sized role because Self is going to find room for a guy who defends and a guy who shoots like that. And so I do think that there's that. I know we probably want to get to break here before too long, but real quick, I think one of the interesting things about this team is going to be the spacing. And I think a lot of people who are KU fans almost kind of roll their eyes because they're like, you have KJ Adams next to Hunter Dickinson yet again. The issue isn't necessarily with KJ Adams in that equation because Hunter Dickinson can stretch the floor. He's shown that before. Where the spacing gets messed up is when Hunter Dickinson goes through a big slump and people don't have to guard him out there anymore. When he's able to make those shots and when he's able to play sort of that pick and pop role, the spacing with KJ matters a lot less, and they are, kind of on top of each other nearly as much. And so even with all the new additions and all the guys we talked about, one of the biggest things that can help this team this year, Nick, is just Hunter Dickinson shooting the ball like we know he can and not really going through a stretch like that where he's missing pretty much every outside.
Well, of course, beyond that, it should help that, you expect Zeke Mayo to perform as a three-point shooter.
Sure.
You expect Storer and Griffin to be adequate three-point shooters. So it's not just, last year with Nick Timberlake, the way he was struggling, it was a snowball effect where Hunter Dickinson wasn't shooting well and you didn't have anybody else from the outside. DeJuan Harris, obviously, reluctant to shoot. So that adds to it as well. So I think beyond Hunter Dickinson shooting better, you look around and you expect that these other guys that KU has brought in via the transfer portal will have more success from the perimeter as well. So, I do want to dive more into that. We'll talk more of that, talk more maybe a little bit of starting lineup, maybe some pressure that's on this team as well. That's all coming up on the other side. As always, we have to tell you about our friends at Home Field Apparel. You can look clean, look good at Allen Fieldhouse this fall, this winter with Home Field Apparel. Go over to homefieldapparel.com. Check out the 40-plus items that KU has. They've got Kevin, I don't know if you've seen this. They released this last year, actually. The vintage KU basketball shooting shirt. It's like a 1970s shooting shirt that you could, so you feel like you're part of the team, I guess. 1978 if you want. I don't think if you're wearing that, Bill Self's going to ask you to come on the court and warm up, but
you never know.
Doesn't hurt to try. Plus, they always, if there's college game day or anything, maybe that shirt is what gets you out there to shoot the half-court shot or anything like that. So something to consider. But regardless, you can also get 15% off that shooting shirt with promo code PAYHEED24, 15% off your first order with PAYHEED24. And we're back. More KU basketball talk coming up. Looking for tickets for your next event? Tickets for Less is your number one source. Save big on every purchase when you use promo code KCSN at ticketsforless.com.
When you discover a new binge-worthy show or a song that you bump on repeat and you have to share it with your friends so they can experience just how awesome it is, that's kind of what it feels like when you discover Mint Mobile offers premium wireless for $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. That's such an awesome deal. There's no way you can keep it to yourself. Friends don't let friends overpay for wireless. Say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plan and switch to Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you and your squad with premium wireless plans starting at $15 a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and bring your phone number along with all of your existing contacts. Ditch overpriced wireless with Mint Mobile's deal and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/payheed. That's mintmobile.com/payheed. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/payheed. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, here with Kevin Flaherty. If you like what you are watching or listening, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to drop a comment, subscribe, like. If you're listening on the audio platforms, you can leave us a 5-star rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Share your thoughts. You can also reach out to us on the KCSN Mint Mobile hotline at 913-407-6524 to join in on the conversation. So there's lots of ways to talk with us. You can also follow us on social media. You can follow our podcast account at Payheed KCSN on Twitter. You can also follow each of us individually at Kate Flaherty KCSN. I'm at Nick Springer 29. Kevin, of course, is always tweeting some highlights and great analysis of both football and basketball. So you can go give him a follow. But listen, don't give my guy too much of a hard time about Jeff Grimes. Okay? It's okay. It's okay. You don't have to be too hard on him. But so lots of ways to communicate with us and interact with us and the show. And if you do so already, thank you very much, and continue to please do that as well. It helps us grow here on the channel and on KCSN. So one thing I did want to ask you, Kevin, about this KU basketball team is you look at last season, and Kansas really kind of put all their eggs in the Hunter Dickinson basket, so to speak, in the transfer portal. Whether you believe the NIL evaluations of whatever he got, the point being that he was, sort of the gem of the class. He was the number one overall player of the transfer portal by pretty much every service that ranked the transfer portal. He comes to KU. Kansas is preseason number one, high expectations for KU. And again, I think numbers-wise, Hunter Dickinson, I guess lived up to expectations, but obviously the outcome wasn't because you had injuries, all that other stuff that we talked about. Now you turn the page to this season for KU, and Kansas didn't get maybe the number one player in the transfer portal, but they got a lot of guys that are in that upper echelon. And so Instead of sort of putting their eggs in one basket, they go out and they get an AJ Soar. They go out and they get a Ryland Griffin. They add Zeke Mayo, right? They even end up bringing in a guy like a Shaq Moore, who I think is somebody that could have an impact. But when you kind of look at the strategy for KU this year, it's obvious that there was a difference, right? Last year it was, we're going to go out and have the best 5-6 guys in the country, but then injuries and attrition and so on and so forth kind of wore that down. Now this year, this team looks like they've got some more depth. But when you think about that from a pressure standpoint, is there a lot of pressure on this Kansas team to be successful this year? Because of the fact that you failed you failed last year by Kansas standards. You were a 4 seed, but that's a failure by Kansas standards. Now Bill Self changes his strategy in the transfer portal. They go out, they have more depth this year. Is there really a lot of pressure, you think, on this Kansas team to be successful, to be a Big 12 title team, to be a national contending team this year?
Yeah, I think so. And you look at it's crazy to talk about, right? But Bill Self hasn't failed to win a Big 12 title 2 years in a row. so already you're entering the season knowing that, hey, last year you didn't get the job done, and quite frankly, we're a little ways away from a Big 12 title. And so I do think that there is some pressure to kind of get things right, if you will. I think it's really interesting to see some of the pressure on individual players too, and taking the steps that people want them to take. I do, as you know, a lot of research on, what makes a legitimate national title team. One of them is you have to have a first-round NBA draft pick. No team since the ABA-NBA merger has won a national title without a guy who was picked in the top 30 picks of the NBA draft. That's a crazy stat. And, but it's something that happens. Another thing is the last team, and I hate mentioning this team for Kansas reasons, but the last team to win a national title without bringing back at least 3 guys who started at least 2 games the previous year was Arizona in 1997. And so that's been a big thing, that continuity and bringing back multiple guys that you felt like could start the previous year. Kansas brings back those guys. And so we've talked a lot about the newcomers, but Nick, I think it's just as fascinating to see, okay, you're returning starters, DeJuan Harris, KJ, and Hunter Dickinson. What are the expectations for those guys? I tend to think DeJuan Harris has gone through this really weird arc where he was like underrated and then maybe overrated and now underrated again. And so I think he's kind of underrated again. I'm not a big like racing car guy, like a street racing car, but I have always thought that DeJuan Harris is a little bit like nitrous, right? Like you put him in a Honda Accord, he's not going to help you win a race against a Corvette or something like that. But if you put him on a car that already has a lot of really good parts that, you know, is already really fast, he can be the thing that takes you over the top. I really do think that DeJuan Harris was put in kind of the role last year, not just playing so many minutes, but also having to take on such an outsized role as an offensive player. I think it got him out of what makes DeJuan Harris a really good player. And one of the reasons I'm excited for Shaq Moore eventually is I think he can give DeJuan Harris a lot of cover. Last year, DeJuan, I think, even struggled defensively at times. And I think part of that was probably because it was, hey, I got to play 35 minutes. I can't afford to get into foul trouble. With a guy like Shaq Moore, who's a great athlete, a great defender, you know, can light people up. I think DeJuan Harris is in a spot this year where you could see a return to form where he is one of the Big 12 and therefore one of the country's better defensive guys. I think with the scorers around him, he can be a really high-level table-setting guy. I think the finishing, you know, could take a step forward again this year because he's not being forced to finish. He's going to finish on better opportunities. And so I do think DeJuan Harris is a guy that it's not like he's going to jump up and assume a bigger role. I actually think that he could fall into that really nice, you know, this is the role he should probably fill, and he can be really efficient within that role.
Well, look, people may not see it as a big difference if you're playing 36 minutes a game versus 31 minutes a game. But if you extrapolate that over the course of 10 games, 15 games, 20 games, or an entire season, that is very, very significant. And that's kind of what I think you're getting at with DeJuan Harris, where he feels like he can be at his most peak effectiveness playing that 30 to 32 minutes per game, where he can go out and kind of be a dog on defense and you know, use his energy versus having to play 37 minutes a game, which is what he was at last year, 36, 37 minutes per game, where all of a sudden he's thinking, okay, yeah, I don't want to pick up a foul. And on top of that, I know that I need to save something in the tank, to go back to your car reference, save something in the gas tank, you know, for the last 4 minutes of the game because I'm going to have to play 38 minutes tonight. That makes a big difference. It makes a huge difference. And I think that's where I hope that DeJuan Harris can get to this year with kind of what you mentioned, which is hopefully with guys like Zeke Mayo, Shaq Moore, whenever he comes back, maybe even a David Coit, however much of a role he may play, it can shave DeJuan Harris's minute totals down enough to where he is comfortable enough being that aggressive defensive player all the time, being that guy that feels like he can go all out and shut down an opponent's top player versus saying, hey, you know, there's 8 minutes left in the first half and I've got to play the rest of the second half. I'm going to take a couple possessions off here and save something so I know I have it later in the game, right? And that can be a situation where the game can be won and lost in those situations, right? Where you give up a big run or something like that. So that's what I hope for DeJuan Harris. And then I think on the pressure point for this team overall, I actually wonder if there's less pressure on Hunter Dickinson, you know, obviously he was that number one guy. He was talked about so much. He had his own podcast for you know, talking about that. You know, he was in the spotlight and he wanted to be in the spotlight. Like he didn't shy away from it. And I don't want to say that it came back to bite him a little bit, but like there were games where the spotlight seemed like it kind of got the better of him. I think of the Texas Tech game on the road in Lubbock last year where he kind of just got defeated and Cade lost really big in that game. I almost wonder if coming into this season with the spotlight not being on Hunter Dickinson so much, not being that $2 million man or whatever, if that may help him a little bit, especially early in the year, to where he feels like he can just go out and do his thing for a little bit and build that confidence back up to being the type of player that he can be. I wonder if that will help him this year compared to last year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think there's more around him. I think another thing, too, is Hunter Dickinson really struggled defensively a year ago. You know, it was something where I got a lot of comments last year saying you can't build a good defense around Hunter Dickinson. Michigan had like a top 10 defense around Hunter Dickinson his freshman year, but they had him playing drop, right? They had him playing more, for those of you who are unfamiliar, he was playing a coverage a lot more like what you saw out of Udoka Azubuike in the 2019-2020 season, where he was kind of in the paint and you didn't ask him to move his feet around the perimeter. And I'm interested to see what they do with him this year. Is it something where they're going to continue to have him, hedge a little bit higher like he did a year ago? Or do they say, hey, we got toasted on that? Because they absolutely did.
Especially against Gonzaga in the tournament.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to ask you to do something that, you're going to be more comfortable with. And yeah, if you run into a center who can shoot threes, it's a little bit more of an issue. But you don't do that super often, at least not against a center that can really make you pay for doing it and offset that efficiency. And I think the other part of that, talking about the pressure thing, is I don't know that there's as much pressure on him defensively this year because you do have the Flaherty cover there. Flaherty, that should be the one thing that he can really do at a high level right out of the box. I mean, he's going to be aggressive. He's going to try and dunk everything, whether he should or not. If you've never seen him play, that's kind of his MO is, hey, this is just an audacious dunk attempt, but my God, I'm going to try and go over this guy and throw it down. But I think that where Flaherty's potential is the highest is, Nick, he really moves his feet well, and he's really got a lot of mobility. He can block shots because he can get off the floor later because he's such a quick leaper. You see that sometimes where he'll wall a guy up and then the guy will go up and he'll jump second and he'll still block the shot. And so I do think that if Flaherty develops as a defensive guy the way that he could over the course of the season, it could be a similar situation to we've seen Bill Self in the past have situational defenders, right? Like KJ Adams was a guy like that his freshman year where Self trusted him. Hey, it's the final minutes of a half. It's the final minutes of a game. We trust you to go out there and be switchable and be good in those situations. I think Hunter's got more cover this year because of all of that. And so I think that there's also that part of it where, one, he probably doesn't need to play as many minutes again. And so because you have Flaherty, because you've got more cover there, but the other part of it being you've also got a different kind of defender that you can put out there in those situations where if people are just exploiting Hunter Dickinson defensively again, you've got some options there.
Yeah. And that's going to be the key is this year, and this will be more about Bill Self of, hey, look, you're going to have more opportunity, more guys at your disposal to utilize, right?
Yeah.
And so can you manage that? Obviously, Bill Self's bench is known for being really short, especially as the season gets towards the end, but that'll be something to monitor as well. Something else to really keep an eye on, obviously, is the fact that it's a new era of Big 12 basketball, Kevin. I mean, the Big 12 has added in some really impressive basketball programs. You add in Arizona, you add in Arizona State, you add in BYU, along with Utah and Colorado. Like, it's a new era of Big 12 basketball. And for KU, they're going to get Arizona, but it's going to be not until March, which is a bit of a bummer. Arizona's going to come down to us literally the last game of the season on March 8th, which, listen, depending on how things shake out, could be a Big 12 title-determining type of game, depending on how the season goes. But that's going to be the other thing about this is that, I think part of KU's dominance for so long in the Big 12 was the fact that, especially once the Big 12 went down to 10 teams for a while, is that you knew you were going to get everybody coming down Fieldhouse.
Yep.
That's obviously not the case anymore. With sort of the imbalanced schedule that you have where you're going to be going to some places and other teams aren't going to be coming back, right? I think back to, it was very frustrating that KU had to go play at Iowa State, and Iowa State didn't have to come back down Fieldhouse. That seemed like a bit of a scheduling fumble from my perspective. But this year, Iowa State will come down Fieldhouse. Kansas State, obviously, you got the home and home as well. But the biggest one is you don't have to go to Texas Tech, which I think is pretty huge.
Yeah.
You get Houston at home. Also, you'd have to go back to Houston later on in the year. But point being, like, it is going to be an absolute gauntlet of the Big 12. It feels like you can just kind of you repeat the same talking point every year with the Big 12, which is it's going to be a gauntlet. It's going to be a very difficult schedule, but that rings true maybe this year even more so than past years. And I do wonder from an outside perspective, some of these other programs of the Big 12, if they sense that KU might be a little bit weaker than they have been in the past, right? I think for many years of Bill Self, opposing programs will probably play KU and say, we hope we can win. We hope we can have it be a close game. And obviously KU would roll in and expecting to win, and they would win. I don't know. I wonder if that's changed a little bit. And I wonder if that maybe chafes at Bill Self or at KU a little bit, that they want to reclaim that status as being, the top dog. And you have a program like Houston. You have obviously what Baylor has done with Scott Drew. When you have, I hate to say it, but Kansas State has dumped so much into this upcoming year for basketball. Like they have really essentially gone all in a lot of ways with Jerome Tang this upcoming season as well. And then you look at like a Texas Tech program that's always been pretty good, Arizona. So I don't know. You look around the Big 12, it's going to be tough. And it's, I don't know. Like I started thinking about this last year as the season went on. I think the general talking point is, hey, in Big 12 conference play, it's great that you're playing in the Big 12 conference because every game's going to be tight. You're going to get a lot of experience in close games. That's what you're going to be seeing in the NCAA tournament and so on and so forth. But on the flip side of that, and I hope maybe this isn't the case for KU this year because they do have more depth. On the flip side of that is it gets to a point where you're just absolutely physically and mentally run down from playing, so much that when you get to the postseason, it doesn't matter that you play these close games because your team is absolutely wore out from what they just went through. And I think that certainly happened to Kansas, the attrition with the injuries and the lack of depth, and you hope that won't happen this year with the increased depth that they do have. But yeah, man, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword playing in the Big 12 when it comes to trying to prepare yourself for postseason play, in the sense that, yeah, it's great, but also, you're going to lose some games and you're going to have a team that could be really beat up, physically and mentally by the time you get to March.
Yeah, I think if Kansas wins the Big 12 this year, we're going to wind up talking about the David Coit game or the Jamari McDowell game or the Zach Clements game. And it's funny to think about, obviously for those of you who can't watch, Nick just laughed at me, but it happens like that, right? And it's not that you're planning on it. It's not that, hey, this guy is getting a ton of time, but you wind up having a little injury here. This guy winds up being ineffective. And next thing you know, it's not necessarily that, hey, that guy goes out and drops 25 points and you win, but it's, hey, you just beat Baylor with Zach Clements scoring 8 points in 10 minutes in a game that you had to have it type of deal. There were games in the past where, there was the Amari Traylor game, that you had that, Joseph Yesufu stepped up for the national title winning team when Remy went down. And so depth is going to be a huge thing. And so when you look at how deep this is, I'm glad you brought up Rakeese Passmore earlier, because there could be a Rakeese Passmore game in there where he comes in and he's asked to play some key minutes in a big situation, and how well he plays in those minutes determines whether or not you win a Big 12 title. And that's because the margins are so thin. It's the same for Houston. It's the same for Iowa State. When you look at, hey, they've got guys 7, 8, 9 that one of those guys is probably going to have to make plays in a big game if they're going to win the Big 12 title. And that's how tight everything is. And so having that depth is pretty much a necessity, I think, at this point. And it's the interesting thing to me, Nick, is we're talking about the Big 12. Bill Self has talked about how in the NCAA tournament, you don't actually need to be that deep because for multiple reasons. For one, you don't want to play a guy just to play him, right? You don't want to take minutes from your third best guy and give them to your eighth or ninth best guy just because you have an 8 or 9 guy. It doesn't make sense to take your better player off, but also the timeouts are longer. The way that the breaks are there, you can basically, it's more equipped for a team with 6 or 7 guys to really go there. Conference season is the exact opposite. And so if you want to fare well in the Big 12, if you want to run that gauntlet, that's where your 9th guy, your 10th guy, your 11th guy even can come into play. And I think that that's one of the biggest advantages to this specific Kansas team is the fact that they can go so deep at so many different positions and that they've got so many varied type of options, right? There's not a ton of guys that look at the point guard spot. I mean, DeJuan Harris is different than Shaq Moore, who's different from David Coit. And, that's not even talking about Zeke Mayo potentially getting some minutes there, which he could do as well. And so I do think that having the ability to win multiple ways with a lot of different types of guys is a major advantage for this Kansas team this season.
If you had to project the starting lineup for the first game of the year, what do you think it would be at this point? I think, there's some obvious picks here, but you had to go for the full starting 5 when Kansas walks onto the floor at Allen Fieldhouse on November 4th against Howard. What do you think they're rolling at?
So this is the fascinating thing because I think it could go one of two ways. I think 4 of them are pretty set at this point, or I believe that 4 of them, are likely to start. I think you're going to have DeJuan Harris and Zeke Mayo together in the backcourt, and I think you're going to have KJ next to Hunter Dickinson at the 4-5. That 3 spot is interesting, and the reason why is I think it's going to be A.J. Storr, and I think it's going to be A.J. Storr for most of the season, if not all of the season. But we just talked about with A.J., kind of Bill Self trying to mold him and get him to a certain spot. So would it really surprise you, Nick, if Bill Self sent that first start to somebody else as kind of a little bit of a way to send a message? And this would all be moot if AJ takes care of business in practice. If he's defending and rebounding in practice, absolutely plug him in at the 3. We're good to go. But if he's not doing the things that are asked from him, would it really surprise you to see Bill Self hand that starting spot to somebody else just as a way to say, hey, you got to take care of this other stuff or you're not going to be in that starting spot?
I am going to repeat an old Bill Self adage here. It don't matter who starts, matter who ends the game. So even if A.J. Storr is the starter, what if he can only play 20 minutes and the other 20 goes to Rylan Griffin and he plays in the critical moments? So that could be a possibility. I think for the most part, I am in agreement with you, though. Obviously, I expect, DeJuan Harris, Hunter Dickinson, and KJ Adams to be locks, to be starters at this point.
Yep.
I think earlier in the summer and the spring, there was a conversation to be had about that second guard spot.
I agree.
I think at this point it's Zeke Mayo, like pretty much 100%. Then that leaves you with that 3 spot with probably either AJ Storr or Rylan Griffin. And I think at this point I probably would lead Storr to start. But again, I'm expecting, when you go through like the minute distribution, it's going to look so much different than it was last year, right? Like last year, the starters were playing 33 minutes per game, basically 30 minutes per game plus. I think there's going to be many games where you will have a lineup of what I just listed: KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson, AJ Storr, Zeke Mayo, DeJuan Harris starting, but Hunter Dickinson or KJ Adams plays 23 minutes and Rylan Griffin plays 20 minutes and AJ Storr plays 25 minutes and Marquise Fastball gets it's not going to be. That's kind of what I mean by the Bill Self adage, which is like, the starting lineup this year specifically, I don't think is going to be like as important. And Bill Self has always said it's not important. But when you look back last year, it was because of the fact that those were the only 5 guys you had sometimes, it felt like. So this year, I think it'll be different. But yeah, I think for my money, Zeke Mayo's locked into the 2 spot. I think at this point, AJ Storr probably for the 3. We'll see how that goes, but should be an interesting season as always for KU basketball. If there's one thing with KU basketball is that there's never any shortage of intrigue, of interesting storylines, of all kinds of different stuff regarding this team. So, and like you said off the top earlier, Kevin, like Kansas could be a preseason AP, number 5, number 4 team, and that might be like 3rd or 4th in the Big 12 to start the year. So we will see how that shakes out also. But it should be an exciting season. Late on the Fog is next Friday. It's October 18th, if I have my dates correctly, which I believe I do. And then they'll be having an exhibition against Arkansas the week after. And, of course, the season then begins on November 4th. They got an exhibition with, like, Washburn thrown in there as well. But, we're less than a month away from the start of KU basketball season back at Allen Fieldhouse. So we'll be talking plenty of that. We'll still be talking KU football throughout the rest of the season as well, as bad as it gets. I know somebody messaged us on Twitter, Kevin, and said you should just go live after every KU game for 1 minute and say, why are we here, and then end the stream. And here's what I say. I'm not leaving. The show goes on. I don't care. I'm going to be here no matter what. That's right. We're going to be here no matter what for KU football, for KU basketball, all things KU throughout the rest of the football season, into the fall and into the winter and spring with KU basketball as well. If you like what you heard, you can always share your thoughts. Give us a thought. Shout outs. Head over to the KC Cinema mobile hotline, 913-407-6524. If you're watching on YouTube, drop a comment, share your thoughts, ask us a question. We may, Kevin, I kicked around the idea of doing some sort of like mailbag type show, or people send in their questions to us. So if you think that's a good idea, which, listen, I don't have very many good ideas. So if it is a good idea, that would be cool, because I don't have very many of those. But yeah, so maybe ask a question in the comments, share your thoughts, leave us 5-star rating and review. Be sure to subscribe, be sure to like, be sure to be subscribed, especially on the YouTube side, because you'll get notified when we will be going for post-game shows for KU football. And we'll probably end up doing some KU basketball live shows as well, post-game, for maybe some of those bigger games that KU has also. So you definitely want to be subscribed on the YouTube side, so you can get notifications from us. You can leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify as well. And for Kevin Flaherty, I'm Nick Springer. Thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll talk to you again soon. We're going to enjoy the bye week a little bit, actually, for KU football. We're going to kick back, relax a little bit. I'm going to go to the beach. No, I'm actually not going to go to the beach. But I don't even like the ocean.
I'll go to the Royals game, and you're going to a Royals game too now, aren't you?
Yeah, that's true. I think we're both going to be at Kauffman Stadium on Wednesday/Thursday, so you may see us there, I guess. No, I'm actually afraid of the ocean, so I will not be going to it. So yeah, the most I'll go to the ocean is like up to like my knees, maybe. I don't know. Not an ocean fan at all. Listen, we've explored more of space than the ocean. How am I supposed to trust what the hell is in there? No, thank you. Hard pass for me.
The shark can still get you at knee level, just saying.
Exactly. And don't come at me with any of those stats of like, well, it's more dangerous to drive a car than, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than get attacked by a shark. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Okay, before we get attacked by a shark on the show, we'll wrap it up here. He's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.